The last time that you and I spoke was actually right after the Kavanaugh and Ford hearing. This was before the decision, or I guess the forced decision, where the Republicans had to agree to an FBI vetting of Kavanaugh and the stories and the accusations surrounding him. I think everyone remembers that the FBI investigation was rather incomplete. They interviewed only 4 witnesses. They did not follow the leads. There are stories after stories of people who were in college with Kavanaugh, who were in high school with Kavanaugh, who had information for the FBI that the FBI simply did not accept, would not sit down with them, would not receive, would not report to the president. That was all part of the program where the FBI investigation was to be a big whitewash. And then ultimately, Susan Collins cast the deciding vote to confirm Kavanaugh. Joe Manchin, a Democrat, took the free vote and ended up voting for him as well. But I think we can talk about whether we think that would have been different had Collins not voted for him. And here we are in the wake of that. Kavanaugh has now officially been sworn on to the Supreme Court of the United States. I don't think he has quite sat down and heard a case yet. There was a case this week that implicates voting rights that was basically punted at a 4-4, but left it to the circuit court decision. We will talk about that. It has big implications for Heidi Heitkamp and the chances of the Democrats holding or capturing the Senate, I should say, in the fall. But let's stop for a moment, and I want to talk about Susan Collins. You wrote a piece this week when Susan Collins gaslit the nation. Was that the Republican Party's final surrender to Trump? One of the things that has come out of this is the notion of never Trumpers seems to have more or less gone the way of the dodo bird. If you were a never Trumper and you are still a never Trumper in many respects, you may not no longer be a Republican. That seems to be the way you're pitching your books these days. But give me your sense. I mean, was that the moment that when Susan Collins basically decided to rebrand herself? Was that the moment that the Republican Party and Donald Trump sort of lost any daylight between them?
Well, that's what I thought. I mean, we'd watched this whole thing unfold, of course. Everybody was riveted to the story of, the Kavanaugh hearings and then the FBI investigation, which, as you pointed out, was, something of a sham. And I've got something else to say on that later that has to do with the further ramifications of that particular arrangement that was made between the White House and the Republican Senate and the FBI. But as far as Collins is concerned, I think, we were all waiting. There had been this sort of dance that was going on with Jeff Flake and Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski and Manchin, and they were all speaking in corners, and people were saying they were trading votes and making deals and what have you. And this idea of the quote, never Trumpers, or maybe just call it, the independent moderates in the Republican Party, that there still existed this sort of last vestige of some kind of a conscience. And in the past, Lindsey Graham would have been one of those guys, or, John McCain or whatever. Lindsey Graham turned into a vicious, poisonous reptile during this situation. I mean, he was out front and he was fully embracing Trumpism, which is just vicious. He was attacking, rape survivors in the hallway, saying you should have called a cop. I mean, he was horrible, absolutely awful. And so, but, that has been coming for a while. I don't think it was really surprising. But Susan Collins, particularly in this situation with it being an issue about rape survivors and, Me Too and women's rights, which she was supposedly one of the last, defenders in the Republican Party. I think people were, still sort of expecting something from her. And that speech that she gave, highly anticipated, we all knew it was going to be the deciding vote, was basically a sort of a moderate's version of a Trump speech. and she fully went with Trump, which is that that's why I put it that she gaslit the nation, because she portrayed Brett Kavanaugh completely the opposite of what he actually showed himself to be to the nation in that hearing that you and I talked about the last time we were together here. She said he was a mild-mannered, thoughtful, conscientious jurist, and in fact, we saw what he was. He was a threatening, petulant schoolyard bully. And she portrayed him as being the opposite of what we all had seen. In other words, she said, you can believe me or you can believe your lying eyes. And that is Trump. That is the ultimate expression of Trumpism. And for Susan Collins, they put her out there. She willingly, in fact, it seemed eagerly, went out there, said that the protesters that had been protesting at the Senate went along with the entire Republican line on that they were all violent and it was an angry mob and, all
right.
this. And basically they were all women. I shouldn't say all women. There were plenty of men there too, but it was led by women, many of them rape survivors themselves, who flew in to protest this. And there's Susan Collins, the moderate protector of women's rights, calling them an angry mob. So she had come, I think that signaled, the final last gasp of the Republican establishment that might have at some point stood up and said no to Donald Trump. I think it's over. It's done. Susan Collins is now just the other side of the coin of Trumpism. She's a woman. She's slightly less crude in her delivery, but the message was exactly the same.
All right. Well, I agree, and I think, and I want to ask you this, and we got to take a break here in a moment, but it occurs to me that I think this calculation was, Susan Collins made a conscious decision as to how she was going to brand herself in this era. And if there was any chance within the Republican Party for there to be anyone other than someone who is like a sentence away from talking about Pizzagate, it strikes me. And I want to pose this question to you. We'll have you answer it when we return. And also, I want to talk to you about that, what you think the implications of the non-vetting of Brett Kavanaugh will be in future nominations. But it seems to me that with the death of John McCain, Lindsey Graham and Susan Collins made the decision that there is no longer a caucus within the Republican caucus where they can brand themselves as reasonable moderates and reach across the aisle types of folks. And they made their decision to basically join the herd. I want to get your take on that and more when we return. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. Be right back with Heather Parton.